Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's May 13th, 2020, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Wildfires have made international headlines a lot in the past few years, most recently due to Australia's devastating bushfires. The country's most impacted state, New South Wales, saw some 25.5 million acres burn, an area roughly the size of South Korea. The smoke was so bad that Australian capital Canberra recorded its worst air quality ever. Dozens died due to the fires, and many thousands more lost their homes before rains came in mid-February and helped contain the blazes. Australia's fire season may have just ended, but over the next few months, most of the world's tropical forest regions will be entering theirs. What's driving the intense fire seasons we've seen around the world? And what can we expect from the 2020 fire season in tropical forest regions like the Amazon, Indonesia, and the Congo? We welcome three guests to the show today to examine the trends shaping tropical fire seasons around the world. Rhett Butler, Manga Bay's founder and CEO, joins us to give more of a global perspective. We're also joined by Dan Nepstad, the president and founder of US-based NGO Earth Innovation Institute, who worked in the Brazilian Amazon for more than 3 decades, as well as Ida Greenberry, who now works out of Sydney, Australia as a sustainability consultant for a variety of entities, like the High Carbon Stock Approach, but previously served as managing director of sustainability at Indonesia's Asia Pulp and Paper Group, one of the largest pulp and paper companies in the world, for 13 years. Greenberry actually just moved to Sydney last July.
So unfortunately, I witnessed the Australian forest fire, and it was really scary because I live in Sydney, and those are days that I woke up, or those are days when in the middle of the night I couldn't breathe because my bedroom was basically full of smoke. Somehow they seep in from the outside, so it's very scary experience.
Manga Bay's own Rhett Butler also lives in a fire-prone area in Northern California, so he's got first-hand experience dealing with the fallout from megafires as well.
Haze has become a big issue in California. So last year, me personally, we did not have power for 5 days because the energy company was shutting off power in order to reduce the risk of fire.
Many of California's recent wildfires were sparked by faulty or aging electrical transmission equipment.
But the haze we had here was as bad as it is in some places in Indonesia and the Brazilian Amazon during the fire season. So the air pollution levels were, worst on record for California.
So what are some of the global trends that emerged from last year's fire seasons?
Last year was a pretty dire year globally for forest fires. So this was both in the tropics, but also outside the tropics. So in Indonesia and the Brazilian Amazon, there were quite significant fires that have been that are consistent with this trend, which has been towards drier, more degraded forests in those regions, then be more susceptible to fire. So when people start fires to clear land, in the Brazilian Amazon, that's typically for establishing cattle pasture, which then may be converted for soy fields or other purposes. In Indonesia, the forest is cleared and then burned, typically to establish either crops or oil palm plantations. So once that happens, you have these dry conditions, and those fires can get out of control and then burn into forest areas. So it may start with burning scrub or deforested areas, but then it can spread into healthy forests and intact forests, essentially, especially if you have, like you do in Indonesia, peat soils, which are, when dry, are very vulnerable to burning.
The drier conditions that we're seeing in forests around the world are largely down to 2 factors.
Climate change, and then also degradation. And so what's been happening over the past 30 to 50 years in terms of degradation is people will go in, they'll cut roads through the forest, they'll selectively harvest timber. And so you get things like edge effects around the fragmented areas where you might have roads. So the edges of the forest kind of die off. You'll have big trees fall down. That'll cause the interior of the forest to dry, changes the structure of the forest to make it more flammable. And then the impact of climate change is you're getting warmer conditions, but then also higher incidence of drought. So the combination of those two things interact and essentially create conditions that are perfect for fire. So that's happening in Southeast Asia, it's happening in the Americas, and it's happening in Africa, both Congo Basin, but also outside the Congo Basin.
And what might the 2020 fire season look like?
2020 will probably be a pretty bad year in terms of fires in tropical forests. So I think the Amazon is setting up for a particularly bad year because deforestation the past few months has been quite high. So that's laying the groundwork for potential fires once the dry season begins. So while COVID has shut down large parts of the global economy, illegal actors aren't necessarily abiding by shelter in place orders or recommendations. And so they're continuing business as usual. At the same time, law enforcement has cut back. So, in an environment where law enforcement, at least environmental law enforcement in Brazil, was already being cut back dramatically, COVID has just made it worse. So, I would expect to see a big fire season in the Brazilian Amazon. I think the attention it gets will depend a little bit on luck in terms of how wind patterns drive smoke. So if smoke doesn't get pushed over major cities, then maybe it won't be a big story. If we go over to Indonesia, it's not looking to be as dry as it has been in some years. But that said, the expectation is there will be a lot of fires. And again, the attention will probably depend on the degree to which the fires affect people in urban areas, especially internationally. So in both cases, it'll be interesting to see the interplay of COVID and fires, because fires and the associated haze tend to cause problems for people with respiratory issues. And COVID is a cardiovascular respiratory issue. And so you could see this interplay where haze gets a lot of attention for the health impacts. It's, we don't know where COVID will be a few months from now during the height of the dry season, but I would say there's a good chance that the health issue could drive more awareness of the fire and deforestation issue this year.
The collision of the COVID pandemic with fire seasons around the world isn't just a cause for concern about compounded health issues. It's also likely to impact our ability to combat the blazes. Many firefighters across the United States, for instance, are already ill or under quarantine, and many others are concerned about contracting the coronavirus while stationed in crowded base camps during outbreaks of forest fires. In U.S. states like California and Washington that are particularly fire-prone, the pandemic has reportedly already strained emergency resources and hampered preparation for the upcoming fire season.
I'm not aware of how well fire preparation is going this year in California. I personally saw a lot of stuff going on earlier this year before COVID and late last year. So after last year's fire season, the electricity company and I think park managers cleared a lot of underbrush and took a lot of steps to reduce fire risk. So I think that will help this year. I don't know to what degree, but at least a lot of that happened out ahead of the COVID crisis. Internationally, a lot of the NGOs that are involved with firefighting, I think are going to really struggle this year, especially outside the Amazon. So last year, there was a lot of attention around fires in the Amazon, and a lot of money went to NGOs that were actually working in the region. So there was kind of this influx of money. That's not the case in a lot of parts of the world, though. I mean, especially not in Indonesia. And so NGOs are going to get hit by both, regulations and guidelines in terms of sheltering in place, but also they're going to get hit by funding shortfalls because money is going to be evaporating from these groups, given that a lot of people who donate money are not in a position to be able to support them this year. We've talked about fires in California and fires to a limited extent, Australia, Indonesia, Brazilian Amazon, but there are also fires burning in other parts of the world. So other parts of the United States have had, very severe fire issues in recent years. Canada, Russia, Madagascar, Congo Basin. It'll be really interesting to see how COVID overlaps with those fires once they start, and whether it makes conditions worse for people.
Deforestation in tropical regions like the Amazon or Indonesia has a complex relationship with fire. Of course, millions of acres of forest around the world are destroyed or degraded by fire every year, about as much as is lost to logging and agriculture combined. But in the Brazilian Amazon, for instance, last year's fires were often actually preceded by deforestation.
Last year in the Brazilian Amazon, there's a much higher incidence of fires in areas that had been deforested. And so typically the cycle is someone who wants to clear the forest will go in and chainsaw down the trees around this time of year. So during the rainy season, just after the rainy season, knock down the trees. And then you want to clear the land so you can use it. And so those areas will then be burned during the dry season. So in the Brazilian Amazon, the dry season, runs from June, July, August, September, October. So it depends, when the rains end, but typically it's in that time frame when the burning starts. And so the intention is often just to burn the area that's been recently cleared. But if it's a dry year and the forest fires are intense, then it can actually burn into primary forest. Where the impact gets really big is that these sub-canopy fires that burn in intact forests have a dramatic impact on the health of those forests. So researchers like Dan Nepstad have shown that if an area of forest has experienced one of these sub-canopy fires, it's much more likely to die off in the future, because those sub-canopy fires, even though might not look like much, have a very significant impact on the health of the forest. There's also a much higher likelihood that it'll just be deforested.
As Dan Nepstad himself explains, to really understand what's going on with fire in the Amazon, you need to understand the different types of fire.
There's a few different types of fires in the Amazon and in any rainforest region. There's the fire that you use to set a cleared patch of forest, to burn a cleared patch of forest, basically getting rid of all of those felled trees, converting them to ash as much as possible in preparation for planting. There's fires that escape into scrub vegetation, into pastures that are unintentional. There are pastures that are intentional. They're management pastures. If you've got a pasture that's full of weedy vegetation, a lot of ranchers will burn them just to knock back those weeds and favor the grasses. The fourth, which is really the most ominous fire, is fire that burns standing forests, so healthy forests. And that's ominous because it kills big trees, and once a forest has experienced a fire, it's more susceptible to future fire. What was happening last year of those four types of fires, was a real big uptick in the first kind. So deforestation was up last year by about 30% first compared to the year prior. And so a lot of what we are seeing are these persistent fires in the same spot, meaning day after day, these patches of forest are burning and have glowing embers and everything that triggers the satellite to register a hot pixel. So now, and that leads to the question of why was deforestation higher? And it's been trending up ever since 2012. This last year, it does seem like there's some impunity. First real burning season after Bolsonaro's election, he certainly came in on a platform talking about, relaxing regulations, about the sort of, he framed a narrative about the Amazon as if it were a giant international conspiracy to protect the farm sectors in Europe and the United States. And so it's hard to measure how much of that influenced the uptick in deforestation, but it certainly is consistent with that rhetoric. Now, going back to the types of forest, the reason there wasn't a lot of standing forest catching fire, the most damaging type of fire, is because it just wasn't dry enough. You really need some pretty severe drought before those healthy forests will catch fire. They're just deeply shaded. When you walk through a healthy forest in the peak of the dry season, it's still really humid in the understory, and it gets to 100% humidity every night. So basically, if it dries down during the day and the interior of the forest, the parts that need to catch fire on the ground, it's going to rehumidify at night because of the very high humidity of the air.
When you hear Nepstad referencing hot pixels, as he did earlier, he's talking about satellite monitoring of forest fires.
So right now on the MODIS satellite and also on the AVHRR satellite, both there is a thermal channel, so that if it's really hot on the land, that thermal channel will register the temperature, and if it's above a threshold, it's registered as a fire. So that provides us with data at the scale of 250 to 400 meters on a side. Each pixel a daily estimate of occurrence of fire or not. And that's what's called hot pixels. And so they literally are registered as hot by the satellite. And they give us a very good estimate of open land fires. So fires, deforestation fires, pasture management fires, accidental fires until they get into the forest, and then we can't see them. So today we have no annual assessment of how much standing forest catches fire basically anywhere in the world, in the tropics, the moist tropics, because those fires that go into forests are small. You can step over them. They are cool relative to the big open land fires. And there's a canopy above them. There's 5 or 6 layers of leaves above them, which all obscure the thermal signal getting to the satellite.
At the height of last year's fire season in the Brazilian Amazon, Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro made headlines with his attempts to shift the blame for setting the fires onto international NGOs, and a feud he got into with French President Emmanuel Macron.
Because of Bolsonaro's rhetoric, the exchange between he and Macron, there was a tendency to maybe exaggerate things a little bit, not just in the media, but some of the spokespeople on the ground. When I saw the uptick in hot pixels, I got on the phone with a lot of our team members to see what they're seeing on the ground, because actually when a fire goes into a forest, it doesn't even register as a hot pixel. I think for me, a really important message every time there's a big fire year is, let's not just deal with this like a crisis. Let's think about a long-term solution and make sure we advance towards that long-term solution instead of just thinking about sending the army out there. And the long-term solution really means in having a well-structured system of early alerts and firefighting teams on the ground. And there are some very effective ones that have put out dozens of forest fires. It's to tap into the fact that serious farmers really don't want accidental fire, and they don't want fire going into their forests. They don't want fire going into their pastures if their pastures are well managed, because that means they have to find another pasture to rent as they wait for the grass to regrow on the one that burnt. Farmers don't like fire to escape into their land because they generally have some orchards, some tree crops. They might have a teak plantation, and all of that is very susceptible to loss through fire. But that also points to one of the tricks in the long run to make the Amazon a place where there's less and less fire, and that is investment. Really looking at the farms of the Amazon as long-term permanent production systems where you're building up more and more fire susceptible assets, orchards, agroforestry systems, well-managed pasture, but also managed forest for timber. And we found in our research around the Santarém region that the more you invest in the land, the less the landholder uses fire as a management tool, and the more the farmer invests in fire prevention, fire breaks, cool season burning. So if you do have to do a management fire, you do it late in the afternoon at a time of year when it's not, where the risk of it escaping is smaller. So I think, the main message from my perspective last year was, let's make sure we're thinking long-term, getting those systems in place, that long-term economic agenda, which is very consistent with the Bolsonaro platform, right? More private sector engagement, more private sector investment, and really professionalizing and modernizing the farming systems of the Amazon.
Nepstad sees investment as one of the key solutions, specifically investment in Brazil's farmers.
We tend to look at these big tipping points around the world, be it permafrost and the albedo tipping point in the Arctic, losing snow mass, heating up the Arctic with a positive feedback. The Amazon is one of those big tipping points, and we have to look at these things that we need, in a way that allows us to manage them. And I think it is possible to think of a reforestation agenda at a large enough scale that it prevents the tipping point or reduces the likelihood of what I call an Amazon forest dieback. And there's some really interesting elements here. One is there's 5 or 6 million hectares of forest that by law, by the forest code, have to be restored. They're on private farms, and those farmers have 20 years to do it. And I think with a small economic incentive, since they have to do it anyway, they would start earlier. And that could come in the form of a forest carbon payment. We've got an exploding demand globally now for forest carbon offsets. And right here in San Francisco, there's 150 companies that have committed to climate neutrality and are looking to buy offsets. They're very interested in forest offsets. So I think there's a chance to accelerate forest restoration on private farms. There's also a chance, just through fire management, to allow 12 million hectares of secondary forest, that's basically forest regenerating on abandoned or degraded marginal lands in the Amazon, to regrow. Basically keep fire out of those ecosystems, those secondary forests, and they will recover. The third task is slowing the loss, right? Keeping primary forests standing. And we hit a low point in 2012 in the Brazilian Amazon. It's been creeping up ever since. I think the same forest carbon market, though, could play an amazingly powerful role in basically compensating farmers to keep forests on their land that they could legally clear, and also compensating them for protecting and managing the 80% of their farms that they are required by law to maintain. And so I think, for me, we just spent a decade with more money, more corporate commitments, more attention to the tropical forest issue than any ever before in human history. But we didn't get one thing right, and that is the incentive on the ground. The farmer in the Amazon or Brazil, his farm is still, or her farm is still worth a lot more if it's 80% cleared than if it's 80% forested. And that margin is pretty small. It's a question of $100 for a hectare of forested land versus $1,000 for a hectare of cleared land. The impacts of that same decision on the global economy through climate change damages is $50,000. So if we can close that margin for the landholder, 100 versus 1,000 per hectare, we can save nearly 500 tons of carbon from going into the air at $100 a ton. So, and damages. So I think I'm actually optimistic that we'll be able to pull these things together and sort of unify the conservation community, the farm community, the businesses that work in the Amazon around this agenda of rainfall security through reducing and reversing the loss of forests in the Amazon.
Nepstad wrote an op-ed for the New York Times last December that cites California's tropical forest standard as the type of mechanism needed to help bring in more of the kinds of investments that could keep fire seasons from being so intense.
I already mentioned that there's this skyrocketing demand for offsets, and a lot of that demand is going to buy offsets from projects, verified emissions reductions from projects of the Vera VCS standard or gold standard or others. And there's a lot of good projects out there. In general, though, I'd say that they have a high transaction costs. It takes a lot of money to develop those projects, and they tend to inflate the baseline. So they sort of overclaim in terms of the emissions reductions they're achieving. You contrast that with some of these, what we call jurisdictional REDD programs, REDD, which stands for Reductions in Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation. And they are getting big results for a tiny amount of money. Just one example is the state of Mato Grosso, where deforestation declined 88% from its historical average to 2012. It was one of the biggest deforesting regions in the world for a few years. Mato Grosso government put in place, with a lot of support from civil society and the private sector, a statewide red strategy, and then a shared vision for increasing agricultural output, for reducing the loss of forests, for restoring forests, for supporting smallholders, and now for bringing indigenous people into this statewide agenda. These two things, RED and PCI, have been there for years. The RED law is 2012. The PCI strategy was launched in Paris in 2015. And only in 2018 did they get their first payment. It was 50 million euros from Germany and the UK, really payment for emissions reductions. That 50 million euros represents less than 1% of the 3.5 or so billion tons of CO2 that have not gone into the atmosphere because of the reduction in deforestation in Mato Grosso. And so let's call that a 1 to 100 leverage ratio, whereas the projects tend to oversell. So for me, the big pivot, and what I tried to say in the New York Times article, is with California finally approving its tropical forest standard, which is designed for Mato Grosso, Acre, states and subnational provinces and governments around the world in the tropics in mind. It's really designed for jurisdictional RED. We finally have a very feasible standard that could make that connection. So this rising growth in demand for forest carbon offsets can go into these highly leveraged programs and give us a much bigger bang for the buck. And so that I think is the opportunity. And the governor of Mato Grosso, Mauro Mendes, is very enthusiastic about making his state the first verified state under the Tropical Forest Standard of California. And there's a lot of purchasers lining up, some here in the Silicon Valley, and tech companies that want to be the first to buy, and other companies as well. We estimate that more than $1 billion could flow into Brazil through this market mechanism if we get it right. Over the next 2 or 3 years, I should say.
As international alarm over the destruction of the Amazon rose last year, Bolsonaro was forced to deploy military forces to combat the blazes. Options could be limited by the COVID pandemic this year, however.
There is another a plan again to really mobilize the army, and I'm very happy that some of these very innovative voluntary fire brigades have been brought to attention. Last year, they went into the fire season. I think they had $20,000 in their account. And a lot of the fires they put out are in indigenous lands. They have about 1,000 trained firefighters right now, but you've got to have vehicles, gasoline, food to get those folks around. And this year they have the added problem of distancing. And how do you fight a fire and, sleep in borrowed places on a ranch or something when you're worried about spreading the virus or catching the virus? And the fact that indigenous people are involved means that the risk of them taking the virus back to their tribes is also present. So you're very correct in saying that this is not just a health risk, that is the smoke from fires exacerbating the symptoms and the effects of COVID-19, but it also hampers firefighting.
So looking ahead to this year's fire season, what can we expect?
The burning season, really, if you think of it migrating from south to north across the Amazon as the intertropical convergence zone, moves with the angle of the Earth and its seasonal migration. So in the southern Amazon, we're probably looking at July for when fires will begin. Further south into the Cerrado, there's starting to be some fires already. There are signs that it's going to be quite a bit drier this year than last year. So that's bad. That increases the chance that fires will escape more and move into forests more. Maybe not virgin forests, but forests that have been damaged by logging or previous fire. The other thing that looks bad is the deforestation rate. its early signs are that it is going to be quite a bit higher than last year. So last year, just to put it in perspective, about 10,000 square kilometers of Amazon forest in Brazil were cleared. The historical average, 96 through 2005, was 20,000 square kilometers per year. So even with the uptick last year, we're still at about half of that historical level. This year, it's going to be higher. It could get us closer to that historical average of 20,000, hopefully not. So you put those two things together, more drought, fires spread more rapidly, and the risk of forest fire grows, together with more deforestation burning, that is cleared plots of forest being ignited intentionally. Those are very hot fires. They launch a lot of glowing embers into the air that can land hundreds of meters away and set things on fire. So those two can work together. If you've got a more flammable landscape because of drought and more deforestation fires because clearing is higher, that could spell trouble. I should say too that all of this is now superimposed upon the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and every burning season, there's thousands of people with respiratory ailments in the Amazon. I've lived in the Amazon for many years. I lived in Paragominas where there were 300 sawmills within about a 30-mile radius. And those sawmills are always burning sawdust. And then you impose upon that the burning season, and it's, you could actually feel the smoke infiltrate your house at 2 a.m. And it's just constant smoke and pollution in your lungs. So these two crises could converge with a major uptick in the suffering and the mortality, the deaths caused by COVID-19. So I'm very concerned on both accounts, and the Amazon cities are not ready for this. Manaus has open graves, literally open graves, long trenches that they're using to bury people.
According to Manga Bay's Rhett Butler,
the fires last year attracted a lot of attention in the Brazilian Amazon because the smoke happened to blow over Sao Paulo. The fires weren't off the charts bad. It was just the fact that the haze blew over a major population center and created this very dramatic darkness over the city. So the same thing has been the case in Indonesia. So the fires are occurring with increasing frequency, but they tend to garner the most attention when the haze blows over Singapore and it becomes international incident. And so that's created a lot of tensions between governments at times. For example, during the recent haze, Singaporean authorities were removing Indonesian paper products from the shelves in Singapore. That sent a very powerful signal to Indonesia. The irony is that a lot of the companies that are associated with large-scale deforestation, which is creating conditions that enable fire, are actually based in Singapore or listed in Singapore. So this issue cuts both ways. This year, I would expect to see something similar. Last year was particularly dry, but the conditions that contribute to these fires haven't changed. So there's still a lot of deforestation going on. Indonesia has proposed this omnibus bill, which would greatly reduce environmental protections. So things like that, will just further exacerbate the conditions that drive the fires.
Ida Greenberry notes that
there are two key major causes of fire in Indonesia. Well, the first one is, of course, climate change is happening. Climate change is happening globally, and it basically increased the temperature, the world gets drier, so the whole thing is, of course, influenced Indonesia. And secondly, which is very typical Indonesia, is the peatland. As you probably know, Indonesia has about 20 million hectares of peatland across the country. Most of them already been converted or drained by the government or private sectors. When you drain peat, then of course the peat becomes dry and dry leaves, dry organic matter is very easy to burn. So, and to make the matter worse, of course, Indonesia is basically experiencing climate phenomenon like El Nino, La Nina, the Indian Ocean dipole mode, which has been made worse by climate change. So the combination of these three actually what are the main cause of forest fire in Indonesia in the last probably 10-15 years.
Greenberry has not only experienced the impacts of wildfires in Sydney, Australia, where she now lives, but she's witnessed firsthand forest fires in her native Indonesia as well. She says wildfires have become more intense over the past decade.
The first direct experience that I had with forest fire was in 2004, I think, 2004. And I was inside the forest in Riau province in Sumatra, and together with other forest firefighters, and basically trapped in between fires around me. And I saw the peatland around me. They spray fire, they literally spray fire from under the ground. So that was the first time I saw something like that happen. But then years and years later, I saw how, well, the one that I directly felt as well, the temperature in Sumatra, for example, or Kalimantan, are drier than before. They're drier and just really, really hot. The surface temperature has become more hotter and hotter over the years. And the latest fire that I witnessed myself was in 2015. You probably heard it was probably the biggest fire in history in Indonesia. And that was when the first time I saw fire tornado, and how the wind was basically working together with the fire to just destroy everything. So my thinking, yes, it's getting worse, definitely getting worse.
The haze problem created by Indonesia's wildfires is largely due to the burning of peatlands, she says.
Peatland is a very strange character when it's burned, unlike forest fire on mineral soil or dry soil. Peatland has a very funny character. As you know, peatland is supposed to be underwater, or has a very high water level in normal natural peatland. But because it's drained, so the water level has become probably 2 meter or even 3 meter, deeper than normal. And at peatland, it's of course contain dry leaf, dry twigs, and those organic materials. So when a peatland forest is burned, the forest on top of the peat is of course the major fuel close to the ground that creates the fire. But once you extinguish the fire on top of the peatland ground level, the fire doesn't disappear. The fire actually seeps in under the ground inside the peat area, because the peat itself is still dry and underneath there is water. So then the fire continue burning inside the peat under the ground, and it travel around, and because it's closer to humidity, that it creates this haze. And although you already get rid of the fire, and the haze can continue for days, and that's of course really bad, really create really bad pollutions. I can't recall how many people actually, local communities actually suffer from it the last time there was forest fire. And of course nowadays with the COVID pandemic, I'm really, really worried.
As elsewhere, Greenberry expects the COVID pandemic to compound a number of issues both before and during Indonesia's fire season.
I'm also an advisor to the Indonesian Palm Oil Farmer Union in Indonesia, and I spoke to a few of them just a couple of weeks ago, and they really suffer. The farmers in the middle of nowhere in Kalimantan and Sumatra, they really suffer during this COVID pandemic, because first, most of them have not received any help, any support. No economic stimulus reached them, and what really afraid of is that because of the lack of the economic stimulus from the central government that is received by these farmers in the middle of nowhere in the jungle, the forest dwellers, and they have no choice but continue burning, and that's what I'm afraid of. First they don't receive any economic support. Secondly, they are probably under certain type of isolation because of the COVID, and the price of commodities that they're basically trying to sell on, in this case is palm oil, has plunged, has dropped even before COVID, and they have no other choice but continue slash and burn to basically to survive. And then that's really worrying me, because that happened before. And secondly, there are also actors that would use this opportunity to divert attention, because everybody else is talking about, busy with COVID, and then there are certain actors basically, hey, nobody's paying attention to the forest, and let me just burn it and claim the land as mine. It's been happening for many years, but now because of COVID, there's a diversion. So this is something that I'm really worried about, despite the fact that Indonesia will have milder, drier season this year. But because of COVID, it might get worse.
Greenberry elaborated on her fears that even though the fire season is expected to be milder this year, the COVID pandemic could make it a tragic one all the same.
Yeah, well, that's based on what I've been reading, because there will be no global phenomenon. There will be no El Nino, no La Nina, and no Indian Ocean dipole in 2020 in Indonesia. So they're expecting that the fire season will be milder. Drier season, of course, is going to happen during May and September as usual, but there will be no other phenomenon that will make it worse. But there is COVID, and that's why I'm afraid about the slash and burn will continue.
Greenberry says that responsible peatland management is one key solution to making Indonesia's fire season less intense, and she sees the high carbon stock forest approach as one way to achieve that.
Responsible peatland management is not really being done right now. A lot of people, whether it's from the government, companies, and other stakeholders, tend to turn a blind eye or tiptoe around the big issue. The big issue is responsible peatland management. I mean, like the president and also so many other scientists said, peat needs to stay wet. And when peat stays wet, the type of trees or plantation that is living in that wet peat should be species that is flood tolerant. And it's not being done. Not enough research being done. There are some research happening here and there, but they're not really coordinated. And I think the fact that there are 20 million hectares of peatland in Indonesia, we have to seriously thinking about what kind of a flood-tolerant species or trees can be grown in peatland without sacrificing the viability of peatland itself. And I don't think it's being done. And so a lot more research need to be done. So the research initiative, think tank, private sectors, and the government need to sit together. It is obvious that palm oil plantation, for example, cannot grow on peat, but there are a lot that is growing on peat. Certain plantations, they die in re-wetted peat. So what other type of trees that can grow there? I don't think we have even touched the surface of the issue of what is the responsible and sustainable if it exists. Responsible peatland management is. I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think anyone in the world is there yet. I've been working with high carbon stock forest initiative for many years, since 2014 basically, and it's a really good initiative to clearly define what zero deforestation is. How can people or companies or government implement zero deforestation? I want to say something about this, how important high carbon stock forest is to prevent fire, because high carbon stock initiative, of course, automatically include peatland as a protected area. And in the high carbon stock forest initiative, there is conservation land use planning that requires high carbon stock forests to be protected to ensure ecological viability, which means for peatland to make sure that peatland stays wet or to be re-wetted. So when high carbon stock forest is healthy, there's so many things that companies or government will take or communities will take benefit from. Well, first of all, of course, the water level. The high carbon stock forest will, if it's conserved properly, it will maintain the hydrology or the water level of the peatland, the riparian areas and others. And of course, it maintains the transpiration process, to create rain. It maintains temperature. So if we can restore back some higher carbon stock forests that we have lost over the years, and if we can connect those fragmented high carbon stock forests in the landscapes, and if we can stop deforestation totally, to maintain the whatever high carbon stock forest left in Indonesia, I'm pretty sure that we can prevent bad forest fires from happening again in the future.
If you enjoy the Manga Bay Newscast, we ask that you please consider becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. We're a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month will really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. Supporters at the $10 a month level also get access to our members-only insider content. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Front Line, please head to patreon.com/mangabay to learn more and support the Manga Bay Newscast. That's patreon.com/mangabay. And don't forget you can subscribe to the Manga Bay Newscast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And of course you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mangabay.com. If you prefer to keep up with Manga Bay on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @mangabay on both platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your host Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.